My name is Mark Nordenberg. I chair the commission. I have the privilege of welcoming you on behalf of each of its members. They include Senator Kim Ward, the Majority Leader of the Senate, Senator Jay Costa, the Democratic Leader of the Senate, Representative Carrie Benninghoff, the Majority Leader of the House of Representatives, and Representative Joanna McClinton, the Democratic Leader of the House of Representatives. So why don't we begin with Dr. Kuniholm. She has been here to testify before. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me. I am not going to be showing you the maps in their entirety because once you look at a map, that's all you're going to do is just look at the maps, and the links or the URLs to the people's maps are in the supplemental testimony that I believe all of you have. What I want to do is to tell you kind of the story behind the maps, the priorities, the process, and a little bit about how we are evaluating the maps we've done, and we'll be evaluating your maps as well. When we launched Fair Districts PA in January 2016, the immediate goal was to offer support for a constitutional amendment already introduced by Senators Boscola and Brown to create an independent citizens redistricting commission. Such commissions are now completing their work in 7 states, and we have a chance to watch how that process plays out. But here in Pennsylvania, that bill and others like it never received a final vote. When time ran out for such a commission in this redistricting cycle, Senator Boscola and Representative Thomas introduced LACRA, the Legislative and Congressional Redistricting Act, providing clear guidelines for the redistricting process and product. Those bills also did not receive a final vote, but given new tools available to everyday citizens, we decided last spring we would do our best to demonstrate those principles in practice by creating our own people's maps. As a way to jumpstart that process, in late June, we announced a LACRA mapping competition, inviting Pennsylvanians to draw House and Senate maps using Dave's redistricting app or District Builder, with a deadline less than 3 weeks later. The rules were simple: meet the criteria proposed in LACRA. Those criteria affirm the constitutional requirements that districts be compact and contiguous. We added a requirement that counties can't be split more than mathematically necessary, +1 for Senate districts and +2 for House districts. The minimized splits is in the Constitution, and yet that seems to not have carried much weight, so we thought putting an actual guideline on it would perhaps hold it in better focus. LACRA also prohibits splitting precincts. We've seen firsthand the confusion to voters and the administrative burden to election officials and the potential for longer lines caused by precinct splits. Beyond those requirements, LACRA affirms the principles embedded in the Voting Rights Act, stating that districts shall provide racial and language minorities with an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and may not dilute or diminish their ability to elect candidates of choice by themselves or in coalition with others. Secondary criteria include protection of communities of interest, respect for natural boundaries, responsiveness to voters, and limits on partisan bias. Despite the short time frame for the contest and the significant investment of time needed to create PA state and House districts, particularly House districts with their 203 districts, we received 25 entries from 15 different mappers. And that set off a round of mapping conversations with redistricting experts willing to help evaluate maps and select the top 5 in each category. The winning maps were instructive. In Pennsylvania, the constitutional values of compactness and contiguity and as few splits as possible can work in opposition to each other. Our counties and municipalities are rarely compact. Often they have squiggly lines, sometimes formed by rivers. Some are not contiguous, so to make districts contiguous can take some ingenuity. Minimizing splits to the exclusion of other concerns can yield unresponsive districts and can lock in partisan bias across the map as a whole. Maximizing the influence of racial and language minorities can work in opposition to compactness and minimize splits. Maps that excelled in one area often did poorly in others. We did not plan to choose a winning map because we knew that there was no way to say which is the best. Metrics need to be held in balance. Instead, we had planned to identify 5 in each category that balanced criteria effectively. And from those, we drew metric baselines any good map should be able to meet. And I will share a few slides as we go along. We found that metric patterns are a bit different for House and Senate, since smaller districts can provide more opportunity for racial or language minority influence, while larger districts are less likely to force split municipalities in approaching population equivalence. Once we had identified winning maps, we invited those mappers to help us in the next phase, adding community input. Several of the winning mappers were high school students heading to college, several were starting grad school, one a campus minister, one a teacher. Two were able to promise substantial time to the project. Michael Scroce from Chester County, a senior at Millersville University, updated his house map with 2020 census data when it became available in August to provide the starting point for our house map. Michael Waxenberg, an IT risk specialist in Pike County, who has given testimony here, did the same to provide the starting point for the Senate map. From there, we examined the other winning maps to pull in good solutions to difficult areas while inviting input in regional and local community mapping conversations. We were aided in that by volunteers across the state with local and regional insight and networks fostered over the past 5 years. Not all members of our mapping team were mappers. One, Karen Calhoun, drew on her experience in library science to compile a searchable spreadsheet of all location-specific testimony from public hearings and comments submitted online to this commission, to the state government committees, and to the Governor's Redistricting Advisory Council. All of that testimony was consulted as we fine-tuned our maps. On October 27th, we held a virtual press conference attended by about 250 supporters from across the Commonwealth to announce draft maps and invite public feedback. Last week, we adjusted the drafts to incorporate the certified adjusted data and as much feedback as possible and released our final maps last Wednesday, November 10th. The final maps include the Unity maps prepared by Pennsylvania Voice, combining community maps drawn by hundreds of local mappers. Our maps also include input from dozens of community mapping conversations. Some of those were large regional events. Some were very focused Zoom meetings with local administrators or community leaders in places that we were struggling to understand the best way to provide representation. Those meetings involved dozens of organizations from well over half of Pennsylvania's 67 counties. Testimony and feedback forms added local insight from almost 300 more individuals with input of some form from every county in the Commonwealth. We do not claim that our people's maps are perfect. As Michael Scroce, our college mapper, said in our virtual press conference, it's really easy for citizens to produce a good map that is better than our current maps, as you can tell from looking at the metrics. It's really challenging to create a great map because creating a great map involves engaging citizens from every county to hear their specific concerns and insights about their community. And most of all, it's impossible to create a perfect map. There are always going to be some winners and some losers, but the goal is to make everyone as happy as possible or to spread the unhappiness around. While not everyone will be happy with every part of our maps, we have already had many endorsements from some surprising directions, and you will see some of them on your own comment portal. We have a team still counting split municipalities and split school districts, but the metrics we've already seen show significant improvement over the current House and Senate maps. And here are the metrics comparing ours to the current maps. There's a large, important national debate taking place about the best ways to ensure maps that provide fair representation. Some advocates suggest that a fully public process with an independent citizens commission with no involvement from legislators and no attention to data or metrics is the only way to ensure fair maps. Others argue that reliance on clearly defined metrics enacted into law may be even more effective. LACRA affirms and clarifies values in our Constitution, Voting Rights Act, and legal precedent, while also providing for public input as maps are drawn and then before they are finalized. We believe our government, our elections, and our district maps belong to the people they're intended to serve, and that our democracy works best when we have a voice in every part of that, with districts that reflect communities well and maps as a whole that are responsive to the majority will of the people of Pennsylvania. This commission, your commission, is already well on the way to showing what a fair process can look like. Your chair, your hearings, your website, and your provision of necessary data all correlate with LACRA provisions. I encourage you to continue in that course and adopt LACRA priorities as you draw your maps and invite public feedback. In doing so, you could provide an important encouragement to the people of Pennsylvania and to the entire national conversation about redistricting. I'd like to address a few specific issues we wrestle with. First, numbering and attention to incumbents. The LACRA contest allowed for contestants to start from the core of current districts. A few tried, as I have and others of our mappers, but the consensus has been that the current maps are so distorted that adjusting them further to reflect population changes yields even more distortions. The maps we used for our final maps started from bare maps without attention to incumbent residences. We continued in that, and then at the end renumbered as logically as possible given the uneven distribution of districts, starting with 1 in the northwest corner of the state and ending with 50 and 203 in the southeast. We had multiple conversations about how to handle the fact that Senate elections are staggered based on odd and even number districts. We did not have exact addresses of senators, determined not to obtain them, and numbered as well as we could without that information. We did not attempt to harm or benefit any legislator or potential candidate. We affirm the value in continued consistent representation when legislators serve constituents well, but we know that the current districts are so skewed that this may be the decade for radical revisions. It would also be helpful to renumber districts, whether they include current cores or not. It's confusing to have Senate District 40 in Monroe and Northampton, 44 in Montgomery and Chester, 48 in Lebanon, Dauphin, and York, with other districts in the 40s in the far western side of the state. Renumbering both maps in a similar way would help address confusion. Second issue of concern, geography. For 5 years, I've fielded calls to FDPA's 800 number from folks across the Commonwealth who want to voice their complaint about districts that make no sense given their local geography. I'm sure you have heard some of those here. I've heard from people in rural South Central PA whose best route to their representative's office is a 40-minute drive through Maryland. I've heard from people in Northeast PA who have to drive through 2 other districts to get to their senator's office. I've heard from folks in urban districts who can't walk to their legislator's office because it's on the other side of a river where there's no bridge, and the only public transit requires multiple transfers. This is an egregious one that we've spent some time talking about. Lebanon County with a piece of Dauphin and then crossing the Susquehanna River to a part of York where there is no bridge and where the folks in York say they have never seen their state senator in their part of the district. In drawing the people's maps, we worked hard to find out where our ridges and rivers should be considered clear boundaries and where river or ridge towns might be seen as communities of interest. Another concern of geography, in our most rural areas, districts can sprawl across many counties to gain appropriate population. We looked for ways to mitigate that by attempting to keep those districts as compact as possible. The third area is communities of interest and minority representation. We are well aware that there are many ways to interpret communities of interest. We gave high priority to communities of interest as defined by minority groups themselves, as with the PA Voice Unity maps, which you'll hear about later. We incorporated them as closely as we could, making small adjustments to avoid splitting precincts and to address population equivalence. We know that some of those districts look oddly shaped. Some might even say they are gerrymandered. Gerrymandering, by definition, is the manipulation of district lines for partisan or personal advantage. Extensive case law supports lines drawn, even in strange shapes, to avoid vote dilution of racial or language minorities. In some parts of Pennsylvania, geographic sorting is deeply rooted in racial and economic inequity, including historic segregation, redlining, and now gentrification. Even in the last decade, minority communities in cities like Pittsburgh have continued to be pushed to the margins as desirable riverfront properties or trendy neighborhoods have seen prices rise. Districts drawn to address these inequities and to ensure marginalized communities can participate fully are legal, appropriate, and a high priority for Fair Districts PA. Well, the Unity maps were a big contribution to our efforts on behalf of minority representation. We also did additional research and networking on our own. Growth in Pennsylvania's population in the last decade was driven by growth among Latinos, yet Pennsylvania has never had a Latino senator. We spent considerable time asking about ways to create a VRA Section 2 Latino Senate district, but the population density was not adequate. Instead, we created 2 Latino opportunity districts, one in Allentown and one in Philadelphia, with a Latino influence district along the Route 222 corridor in Berks County, linking Kutztown and Reading. These are not VRA-compliant districts and may not yet have the citizen voting age population to elect a Latino senator, but they provide opportunity for the future, lend encouragement for the present, and acknowledge the need for more equitable representation. We also looked at ways to maximize Latino influence in the House with the Latino Unity District in Lancaster, 2 in Reading, then 2 majority-minority districts, and 2 minority-influenced districts in the Lehigh Valley. In Philadelphia, the Latino community was divided carefully into 3 districts, all with input and feedback from local community leaders. Across the state, we looked at ways to maximize minority influence with the minority influence district in Erie and House districts in Philadelphia drawn to maximize the influence of dispersed Asian neighborhoods, as well as coalition districts in diverse immigrant communities. 2 other forms of communities of interest were mentioned often in testimony. We've all heard compelling testimony from college students about the harms of divided campuses, as seen in places like State College. In some places, large campuses sprawl. In others, they straddle county lines, but we did our best to keep all of Pennsylvania's more than 160 colleges and universities intact, with help from people who live in those local communities, to encourage and support civic engagement on the part of young voters. We also tried to keep school districts together. In many places, those are our best indicators of communities of interest. In counties with very large or sprawling districts, it was not always possible to avoid splitting those districts. In fact, some are so large they can't be contained in one House district, but we did our best to keep them as intact as possible. A surprising number of PA's school districts span county lines. Since minimizing county splits is in the PA Constitution and school districts are not mentioned, county lines took precedence except in places where population adjustments required some crossing of lines. In those places, we tried to do so in a way that kept more school districts together, sometimes yielding things that look a little strange. On the House map, scalp level along the border of Cambria and Somerset is one such example. On the Senate map, Gregg Township in the far northeast corner of Union County is another example, drawn to be part of the Warrior Run School District in the northwestern edge of Northumberland County. Changes like these may not make a difference in the overall metrics. In fact, sometimes the metrics take a slight hit for adjustments that look less than compact. But for the people in those communities, it can make a big difference, and their feedback and insight were an important part of our process. Before I conclude, I'd like to say just a few more words about metrics. It's not hard to create maps with far better metrics than our current maps, and new digital tools make comparison very easy. Competitiveness and proportionality are not in the PA Constitution or legal precedent, but they do give an indication of whether a map will be responsive to voters. The other 3 metrics demonstrated on Dave's spider graphs are non-negotiable priorities: minority representation, compactness, and splitting. And you can see here how our House compares to the current PA State House. It's easy to see on Dave's redistricting if a map has attempted to address and balance these metrics or simply ignored one or more of them, and it's easy to overlay maps to compare them to each other. For our current Senate and House maps, it appears compactness and minimizing split counties and municipalities was not of much interest. Another type of graphic available on Dave's shows where maps fall with regard to other similar maps. So you can see our current House falls very well in terms of minority representation among the top possibilities, falls within the kind of median range for competitiveness, compactness, and splitting, does well in terms of proportionality. And you can begin to compare again and see where they fall short and where they fall within a median range. Comparisons are not hard to make. I don't have time to linger on these, but they are available in the testimony supplement you've received, and voters will be looking at these as your maps are shared. Another form of comparison is provided by Campaign Legal Center's Plan Score. They have used forms of comparison that have been admitted as testimony in litigation. According to their scores, our maps both have a slight Republican skew, but compared to past enacted PA maps, ours are far more balanced. When we began in 2016, there were very few easily available tools for comparison, and showing the reality of gerrymandering was a challenge. Now, anyone with a computer can see for themselves the difference between a deliberate gerrymander and a reasonable attempt at fairness. This is the comparison of our House map to the current House map. In the same way that we can compare car safety ratings without knowing the many tests and equations behind them, we can also compare district plans and see where they fall short or how much they are skewed to benefit one party. As I said, our maps are not perfect. Some counties have more divided municipalities than we would like. Some areas were much harder to map than others. Some districts wander more than we would prefer. Not all requests in testimony or feedback could be accomplished. But overall, we're proud of our process, proud of the maps, and proud of how many people we've taught to study and evaluate district plans. We're happy to share our maps and invite continued review and evaluation, although we won't be making more changes. Now it's up to you to decide what you're going to do with them. We look forward to the chance to share and evaluate yours sometime soon. We ask you to consider the balance of priorities proposed in LACRA, and we invite you to meet or exceed our metrics while including the concerns and ideas of Pennsylvanians about what their own districts should be. I appreciate this chance to share our work, and I'm happy to answer any questions now or as you continue your own mapping process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions from members of the commission?
Me,
Leader,
Chancellor.
Leader Ward.
Thank you. So I'm interested in, you talked about the Latino district in Allentown. That's already all there. Does that get combined with another area in order to make it a more competitive Latino district?
Are you speaking for the Senate or for the House?
Senate.
For the Senate, there is not, if you look at the way the Senate has been drawn currently, the Latino community is divided. It's not kept as compact as possible. That district is rather strangely divided. So I would say that our Senate district map does a much, much better job of keeping that Latino community together.
Leader McClinton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Kuhlman, for your testimony and your galvanizing of support across the Commonwealth for the last 5 years. So you have, of course, rightfully argued this afternoon, again today, that so much of our current map was gerrymandered for partisan purposes, but just as importantly, failed to adequately reflect the diversity in our Commonwealth in terms of both ethnic and language minorities. Now, you have raised concerns and questions about this, and you've even given us demonstrations of areas where we can improve the fairness. But one thing that you did note is that so many of these different groups are not fairly in one municipal boundary or within one county. So, as we get ready to, in the very nearer future than it has been, have a map in front of the public, what would you propose we do to have as an acceptable population deviation to make sure that this map will achieve the diversity that is, in fact, of our Commonwealth?
So that by law, by legal precedent, diverse population deviation is allowed to be plus or minus 5. In our last PA House and Senate maps, it was plus or minus 8, plus or minus 4 for a combined total of 8. And I believe I had a metric, I showed the metrics, here it is, population deviation. If you look, the current Senate map is 7.96. We were able to do a People's Senate map, 4.98, and I think it's possible to get better minority representation than what we did. I'd be really curious to see how you do it, because we worked hard on that. The current PA House map is 7.88. Ours is 8.04, and our metrics on minority representation are quite a bit higher. I believe we accomplished 29 majority minority districts compared to, I believe it's 23 currently. So that's an additional 6 majority minority districts that we were able to do without going beyond the 8. But we have no strong opinions about population deviation. By law, it can be plus or minus 5.
Thank you.
And I will say one other thing. It does, there are places where I think it's really important and appropriate to split municipal lines because the minority populations do cross those lines. And that's certainly the case with the Pennsylvania Voice Unity maps. There are places where you might say, well, they divided some municipalities to do that. Municipalities are not, often the actual lines have racist reasons embedded within them. And so I think it's important to recognize that there are and I've had legislators point to their own municipal lines, their own non-contiguous districts, and say, well, there are some stories behind this, and those stories often have to do with historic racism. So I think to draw maps that address that historic racism sometimes will cause more municipal splits than you might like, and that's actually the case. As we added the PA voice maps, our splits score went down, but our minority representation score went up, and I think that's an appropriate trade-off.
Other questions? Senator Costa.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for your testimony and the work that you all have done. This was mentioned by my colleague, Leader McClinton. Just a quick question. When we are potentially faced with a situation where the question becomes deviation versus splitting a county, for example, where do you recommend which has the higher priority, splitting of a county or, again, bumping up maybe a 5 on the deviation? You indicated you're at 4, but what if the issue was 5?
So, as long as it's within the legal deviation, I don't see a problem as long as it's within the legal deviation. And as I said, I think the goal is to make sure that communities have input into what's being done, and representing communities is, to me, more important than the population deviation, as long as it's within legal limits. And again, all of these things have to be held in balance. If you just say we're just going to split communities without thinking about it, that's a problem. But if you have a thoughtful reason that is making it more representative for communities to do that, we see no problem with that at all. And again, let me say, so if you look at our metrics for splitting communities, the current House map scores 40. Our People's House map scores 76. And so there are places that are split, but nowhere near the numbers of splits that were done in past maps. And the rationale for the splits in the past maps were never given to the public, but they were either to keep incumbents in districts, which meant getting more and more squirrely and strange districts, or in my own region, very clearly done to maintain partisan advantage. So there have been many splits in the past. I would say we would like to see the metrics closer to ours, but the deviation is not for us a big concern.
I have 2 basic questions. How many Senate maps and how many House maps did you get that became the basis for your further work?
We ended up, we received, I think I said in my testimony the number, numbers don't stay.
You said 25 total?
25 total, yes, and more of those were Senate than House. So so I think we had 15, I believe it was 15 Senate maps and 10 House maps. House maps are much more time consuming to do.
We're learning that. Some of us are learning that. I just also want to make certain that I understand your metrics. The minimization of splits, typically splits are just counted. And so lower is better than higher. But your metrics, higher is better than lower. Can you explain that, please?
So Dave's Redistricting app is a wonderful app, and when we started to evaluate our maps, I reached out to them and said, explain, and they were gracious enough to get on several Zoom calls with us, quite extensive Zoom calls, to explain how they had normalized. So normalized was just to kind of, and they've got, if you look at their site, they've got all sorts of equations which explain how they take different counts and then do different equations so that it all ends up on a rank to 100, which allows it just to kind of compare in a really simplified sort of way. We also are doing our own by hand counts of municipalities, and we're doing our own by hand counts of school districts. That's a much more time consuming process. And so we will also have the actual numbers of those, and we'll do that for your maps as soon as they're available too. Our folks have kind of put together a strategy to be able to count more quickly as they do this. But the normal, as I said, we don't know how the metrics are done when they do car safety rankings. They normalize it so they just have these nice numbers. And behind that are many equations, and the same with the Dave's Redistricting app. They have normalized, they have equations behind it. But they've made it so it's on a rank from 0 to 100 just to make it easy to make comparisons. And if you want to hear more, you'll have to call David Bradley or Alec Ramsey with Dave's Redistricting, or ask Jonathan. I'm sure he can, Jonathan Service, I'm sure could explain in detail.
I've had little to do with equations since my undergraduate days as a math major, and I just as soon not return. So I appreciate your explanation. Any other questions? Again, then, we thank you very much.
Thank you so much.